Good morning and welcome to this News 24 webinar. Today we want to talk about the Southern African region. If you're not watching us live, it is Tuesday, the 16th of July. Rwanda has just re-elected Paul Kagame by an overwhelming majority. South Africa is starting to get to grips with its government of national unity, and we've got a number of elections coming up in the rest of the region. We've gathered today in conjunction with the Hans Seidel Foundation and the Institute for Security Studies. We've put together a group of people we want to talk to who know the region from different perspectives. I'm Philip de Wet. I'm the foreign editor for News 24, and I'm always wondering what impact South Africa has on the rest of this region that is so very different, countries with such different approaches to their politics, and yet so closely linked, certainly in terms of their economic ties with South Africa. With us today, we have a specialist on the media, Gwen Lister from Namibia. You will know her name. She's been around for forever. She has some struggle credentials of her own. She was highly influential in the shape of the media in Namibia today, and she's also interested in the region more broadly. We have Ibo Mandaza. He is a political economist specialist. He's lectured, we did the count this morning, he's lectured in 4 countries in the region. He's well known as a former, he was in exile himself, so he was involved in that side of the struggle. He was a high-ranking civil servant within the Zimbabwean government, and then later he became certainly a critic, someone that was watched very closely. And he's also been trying to get SADC to look more closely into Zimbabwe's own elections. And from the Institute of Security Studies, we've got regional expert Piers Bigot, who is our go-to these days for things in Mozambique. So he has looked into, he was involved in TRC investigations, he was involved in similar initiatives in East Timor. He spent a very, very long time looking at peace and reconciliation. And we want to talk to him about the security situation in the region and how that might impact what is to happen. To set the scene, we've all had these discussions amongst ourselves. South Africa is a very different place from what it was just a few short months ago, and the government of national unity certainly has a big impact on South Africa. It's not clear to me, and the question I'm trying to answer is, does anyone else in the region care? In the back of my mind, always, when we look at this kind of situation, is the Arab Spring, where we saw a kind of a political contagion. Not too long ago, not too far away, we saw in Kenya basically a government brought down by popular protest. And we know that others in neighboring countries keep an eye on those kinds of developments and wonder what it could mean for them. So we want to figure out whether the rest of the region watches South Africa, whether the success or failure of the government of national unity in South Africa might have implications elsewhere on the continent. And Gwen Lister, I want to start with you, please. Can you give us a brief idea of what the political situation is in Namibia, what the scene looks like as we move towards those elections in November? Gwen, you might be on mute. I certainly can't hear you. Can you check if there's a red mic button? There we go.
Okay. I think, you know, in Namibia, the democratic commitment that was so strong at independence with the wonderful constitution and the Bill of Rights is beginning to wane somewhat. I think it's been evident in our past elections where SWAPO had a strong 2/3 majority, which they lost in 2019, as I think, you know, feelings set in that those so-called fruits of independence have not been delivered. I think it's also very pertinent to mention at this point that according to our latest census, and I think this has bearing, especially on the upcoming elections scheduled for sometime in November, that Namibia's population is about just over 3 million, of which 71% of that is, or really youth between the ages of 18 and 35. So the youth are going to be very, very critical as we go forward into the next elections to see what will happen as per the ANC example. This is relevant because, again, unemployment is very high. It's set at something like 35%. I think there's a great deal of dissatisfaction about a number of things in Namibia, not least of all rising corruption, lack of service delivery, And perhaps even more worrying is the fact that there is increasing sort of signs of populism and conservatism, especially among the youth, strangely enough. And one of the issues, you would think we would be talking about very serious issues at this point, but Parliament, for example, is completely obsessed with the LGBTQ plus issue. Namibia's court just recently having struck down the apartheid era sodomy law. So this is the topic of conversation at the moment. And even Afrobarometer, in its most recent perception survey, shows that, in fact, Namibians are leaning more towards feeling that, some kind of autocracy or autocratic government might not be a bad idea. So it's a little bit depressing in that I think the sort of commitment to that democratic ideal seems to be waning.
Gwen, is Namibia basically still a province of South Africa, as many South Africans will tell you? Is what happens in South Africa automatically translated to Namibia economically and politically?
Well, obviously, I mean, it's still true to say that Namibia is still very, very dependent on South Africa economically. And not only economically, but perhaps more importantly, given the situation in South Africa itself with the load shedding. Namibia, of course, gets all its electricity from South Africa, or the majority of it, and we haven't been subject to load shedding. So again, there's some concern that forces in South Africa, especially populist forces, will increasingly be squealing about the fact that Namibia hasn't gone off the grid and it continues to receive electricity while South Africa is suffering under load shedding. So yeah, there are a number of areas, obviously, where we are very strongly linked and very strongly dependent still.
And we talk quite blithely across the region about liberation movements losing the voters, losing eventually power, but certainly losing popularity. That sounds to be true then. I mean, are we talking about a kind of a slow erosion in Namibia in terms of the grip that SWAPO has in the popular imagination?
Yes, I think we definitely are. I do not think, I mean, I'm putting my neck out a bit, but I don't think the scenario that has unfolded in South Africa in your recent elections is going to happen just yet. In Namibia, I think that with our elections in November, SWAPO will probably, it might be a diminished one, but they will probably retain that sort of simple majority that they hold at present. They lost the 2/3 majority in the 2019 elections. One of the problems being, I think, a very fragmented opposition, an opposition that doesn't really have any kind of mass appeal. It remains to be seen in these elections whether the new kids on the block, so to speak, which is named the Affirmative Repositioning Movement, rather a clumsy name, but they started out being activists to take back the land, and they've now registered as a political party, and it's a primarily youth-driven movement, but also somewhat populist in nature. How and whether they're going to make any inroads. The general feeling is probably not very much, but time will tell. But I think certainly SWAPO, the disillusionment is very clear and very palpable in the country as a whole.
Eva Mandaza, we have you here as a think tanker, as someone who works across the region. But let's talk about Zimbabwe first, please, because it's such a fascinating example always. And I can tell you, we know that South Africans are deeply interested in what happens in Zimbabwe. I guess both because, you know, there's a sense of fascination with it. It's a bit of a soap opera that we've been watching for many years and that we're highly committed to, and also because it has such a big impact on South Africa very directly and economically. So we've watched the most recent elections. We've seen a former attempt at a government of national unity. What's your sense of where Zimbabwe is right now politically?
Well, we are quite in a mess, and to take the first point I want to make is that the sharp contrast between the elections in Zimbabwe last August and those in South Africa recently. I think there was a feeling, clearly it helped, the South African elections helped to highlight the failings in the Zimbabwe situation. And you have a summit coming up in Zimbabwe with much excitement and exaggeration, not to mention, which the South African elections situation has helped to sort of draw major contradictions. That here you have a failed election, a flawed election process, one of the worst elections in the history of Zimbabwe, with more revelations as to the extent to which the elections were so flawed, with the electoral commission itself under scrutiny for alleged corruption and involving a South African company for that matter, millions, $100 million at issue, which throws even more doubts on the credibility of the electoral commission, and with that the credibility of the election process itself last year. So that backdrop has helped in many respects, and one has to laud the South African situation for the manner in which the elections were carried out. Secondly, the Zimbabwe situation stays in sharp contrast to the rest of the region, in that we have a history of rigged elections, one. Number two, we have virtually a military state, certainly going back to 2000, when the military was involved in our elections in the form of the war veterans, and more explicitly in 2008, when the military intervened in the electoral process in which Morgan Tsvangirai of the MDC had won the presidential election. And one might argue that was the first coup in many respects. You had the elections delayed by 5 weeks in terms of the election results announcements by 5 weeks, during which Morgan Tsvangirai had to escape, and then followed a government of national unity in a different circumstance, very different circumstance from what you have in South Africa now. And then, of course, the coup in 2017, the coup which no one wants to recognize as a coup, certainly not in the region, not in Africa, but a coup nevertheless, which highlights to this day the importance of the military in the polity of Zimbabwe, and raises questions as to the future of the election process in Zimbabwe. For most of us, electoral processes have become a pure farce in Zimbabwe, and we have said, many of us, that they're not a solution, certainly in the current situation, and we have been since 2016 recommending a transitional authority, during which Zimbabwean reset, economic and political reforms undertaken, and the national institutions restored, and indeed create the situation in which we can have many of our people in the diaspora back home, which is a very important factor, the diaspora. It's shocking statistics. Up to 80% of our skilled and professional people are outside the country. That's a big number. And that has a tremendous impact on both the economy and indeed politics, including the capacity of civic society to stand up to the regime. And right now, the estimate is that maybe up to 40% of the population is outside the country. So we have a very depressing situation in Zimbabwe, politically and economically.
But that's a conversation for later, actually, but I can't resist. So in South Africa, we saw that the foreign vote went tremendously DA. So the opposition, the new parties, the EFF and the MKP, did not draw the kind of protest vote from South Africans abroad. Instead, it was the more established opposition party. Does the foreign Does a foreign vote matter? Will a foreign vote matter in future? And if so, is there still a viable opposition for Zimbabweans in the diaspora to vote for?
Well, first of all, I don't know if you're aware that there is no diaspora vote in Zimbabwe, and for obvious reasons. That the assumption, and a fairly reliable assumption, is that most Zimbabweans outside would be against the ZANU-PF, although there are many ZANU-PF supporters out there. Yes, I think we can discuss this later in terms of the need for electoral reforms in Zimbabwe and how far SADC can impress upon Zimbabwe to do that, not only in terms of allowing Zimbabweans outside to vote, but also the electoral system. Where you and I have discussed this, I believe that we need proportional representation in Zimbabwe, as in the rest of Africa, because we believe proportional representation is given to national consensus, nation building, and inclusivity. But that's another question later, yes.
We absolutely are going to have to talk about systems and processes in the future thereof. But first, Piers Bigot, you watch the region more broadly, I think, than I certainly do. I had to draw myself a little bit of a map to see what's happening the rest of the year and then into the next couple of years. But we have a number of elections coming up. We have a number of different issues in different countries. We've got some countries where the electoral system simply is not trusted for very good reasons. We've got others where underlying security seems to be a problem. Which are the countries that you're watching? Which are the interesting countries when we have this conversation about post-liberation?
Thank you, Philip, and thank you to fellow panelists. Look, they're all interesting in their own ways. In terms of the wider trends around liberation movements, we are obviously watching how this is playing out in several countries. Gwen's spoken about Namibia, but the Mozambican elections that are coming up, which are all set for another Frelimo victory. We had Angolan elections in 22, which were close, but resulted in an MPLA victory, just over 50% of the vote. And we have Tanzanian elections also coming up, which are likely to see the ruling party that's been in power since the 60s retain its position as well. So, you know, there's those hard liberation movement trajectories that we're watching. Then there are other democratic processes, even in Botswana, regarded as one of the most stable democratic countries in the region. There's been some concerns about some of the dynamics within the polity there between the BDP and opposition elements, although the BDP are also likely to win the election again, also in power since the 1960s. Zambian politics is always interesting to watch, given it is the one country in the region where we've seen a significant number of shifts of power from one party to another, not always as smooth as one would like, but one of the pace setters in the region in terms of pluralism, and Malawi as well. But, you know, we have these election processes, and we haven't spoken about Eswatini, and which is an outlier in terms of its own electoral processes, and the dynamics in Lesotho, which continue to bubble away, not completely out of the woods. But I think the wider challenge in the region is around participation in terms of electoral participation. And as Gwen has emphasized, the youth element of that we're seeing this peeling away, movements towards populism in some areas. But I think perhaps a bigger challenge, that is something to watch, but a bigger challenge is folk just falling away from electoral democratic participation, but also more generally in terms of participatory democracy more generally. And that raises real concerns around inclusivity, around notions of how do you build participatory democracy that connects development and progress and options to political processes and institutional processes. And that in turn raises questions about institutional integrity and the challenges of institutions and the rule of law in the region as well, and the varying footprints that are in play. What we've seen in South Africa which has been so impressive, is a constitution holding firm, the rule of law holding firm in a messy democratic space. We see elements of that in the region, but we also see those institutions and processes taking severe strain at the moment.
So, Piers, to the central question then, does it matter that South Africa has gone GNU? Does it influence the rest of the region for good or for ill? Will anyone take note of that? Will it galvanize opposition parties elsewhere? Will voters watch closely to see whether it succeeds or fails? Or are we fooling ourselves as South Africans to say, well, South Africa is the giant gorilla in this region. What happens here must surely follow elsewhere?
Well, we have to wait and see. I mean, I do think at one level it sets a standard in the region, which is important for others to be tested by. I mean, it's not by any means a perfect situation in South Africa, and there are lots of challenges and problems there. But I do think it raises questions about, as I say, constitutionalism and the rule of law and the role of institutions in this process. And we've seen one of the big challenges in the region is what we call here in South Africa state capture. But it's this conflation of party and state interests in places where the state is a primary route to economic beneficiation. And this is a huge problem in many parts of the region, which, we've had in this country, but we have a set of other factors playing out here, which feed into the wider pluralistic nature of our polity around the role of the private sector, the role of the media, importantly, civil society, and of course, I think critically, an independent judiciary. And this goes to the heart of some of the challenges that we see in the region, where there is a pretense at a independent judiciary or independent criminal justice system. But when push comes to shove, at the apex of these systems we see in places like Zimbabwe, and we saw recently in Mozambique, how the apex courts have come down on the side of the incumbents that have been in power for many years. So there's real concerns about partisanship of institutions in the region, and how does one address those? How does one strengthen those? And most importantly at this stage is actually keeping a light on exactly how these developments are unfolding in all the polities in the region.
Same question to you, Gwen. Piers tells us that South Africa sets the standard. Is that true for Namibia and more broadly in the region?
Sorry, just repeat that, Philip.
So Piers has told us that South Africa sets the standard, that South Africa is influential in the region, at least in that context. In Namibia and in the rest of the region, do you think that the fact that South Africa has gone government of national unity, will that have an impact, anything tangible that we'll see over the next couple of years?
It's difficult to say at the moment. As I say, I worry. I see so many similarities in many of the countries of the subcontinent, but also so many differences. And one just doesn't know. I think South Africa is, in certain respects, just so much more progressive than, for example, Namibia. I spoke earlier about that sort of aura of conservatism that is sort of manifesting at the moment. And I mean, we know that's not only in parts of Africa, but parts of the world as well, and especially in the more established democracies. And this is a very worrying sign indeed, I think, especially if it is the youth that is thinking this way. So I'm not sure that Namibia, as I said, I don't think it's going to happen in these elections, but I'm just not sure about the level of maturity in Namibia to accept some kind of sharing of government, some kind of coalition or government of national unity, if that did happen. I mentioned earlier as well this sort of very weak and fragmented opposition in Namibia, and that kind of those opposition parties that are trying to sort of come to the forefront are very quickly discredited. It's always been guessed at, if you like, over the 3 decades since Namibian independence, that the only real opposition in Namibia will come from the ranks of SWAPO itself. I'm not sure whether that is still as relevant, but there just doesn't seem to be a political entity that can come to the fore that can have that same sort of credibility as the liberation movement has gained over the decades of fighting for independence. So yes, I'm not sure whether that would go down very well in Namibia. And obviously in South Africa, it's an experiment still much in the making. So we will see how the GNU plays out. But in Namibia, I don't think we're ready for something like that quite as yet.
Gwen, I know we're breaking up a bit on your side, so I'm going to ask this a couple of different ways. We can hear you perfectly. Does the media still matter? Does the formal media still matter in this context? When you talk about Namibia having a conversation about cultural and social issues, is that still a space that the media is central to? And by the media, I'm talking about, the newspapers and the kind of websites that you and I are involved in. Is it still powerful, and I think in South Africa we can safely say that social media, that kind of the dark media of WhatsApp, played a very big role in this last election. What do you see it playing out as in Namibia?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to mention, because one does tend to sort of hammer on the negatives, that Namibia is, as most people know, rated as the country most free in terms of the media. And I think it is. Whether it's excellent media is another question altogether, but certainly Namibia's media is very outspoken, and there's been very little interference with the media from government, even though, as I say, democracy sits, I'd say, fairly uncomfortably with the ruling party. So that is one of the sort of, what can one say, inconsistencies, really, that Namibia seems to be so free for the media. That having been said, I mean, legacy media in Namibia, like the world over, has been hit some very hard knocks, is still battling for survival, especially seen against the sort of power of the social media tsunami, if you like. But in Namibia, social media is important. If you look at disinformation campaigns that are so prevalent, I can't help looking towards the USA at the moment and see how absolutely awful social media is when you look at the debate about Trump and Biden and so on, and the enormous amount of disinformation. Now, I don't think in Namibia yet that disinformation has reached that level of sophistication, if you like, but it certainly will play a role, I think, in the elections, and is used a lot more, especially by the more youth movements and the populists, to sort of promote their cause. But media, or legacy media, still is influential. Investigative reporting has played quite a big role in uncovering, like in South Africa, your scandals here, the fish rot scandal, which ended up with 2 of our ministers in jail to date. Until today, they are still incarcerated. And so, yes, I think Namibia certainly can flex, or the media can flex its muscles. And when it does, good investigative reporting, then I think people do sit up and take notice. It just needs to do more of it.
Eva, I'm interested in your take on the media, but first I'd like to talk to you about, Gwen talks about the lack of a credible opposition in Namibia. Piers tells us that there's a lack of participation, that we've got this democratic deficit. Whose fault is that, I guess? I mean, is that true throughout the region? And is that because we don't have the parties providing the platforms that people want? Why is it that we saw kind of pop up? We had a formal opposition in South Africa, then we had this pop-up MKP, you had the more radical EFF. It seemed that people had the alternatives to vote for, and they did. Why is that not the case elsewhere in the region?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to understand that the concept of a political party is quite different from the conventional, if I may say, also, as people like Lenin and others define them, a political party. What we have is really movements or platforms for elections to get into office, and especially now where politics has become a livelihood, the difference between being unemployed, no vehicle, and being an MP and therefore having a stipend and a vehicle, and so on and so forth. So we have, and that explains why, in part at least, why there's a plethora of parties towards elections, or that the mobilization for or takes place just before elections. Now, come to Zimbabwe in particular, where we have the very unusual situation, where the formal opposition has been virtually decimated, and made completely. We have a situation where we have a new parliament now, with little or no opposition factor, and where the opposition is so-called now is virtually a branch of ZANU-PF in many respects. So you have a very depressing situation in Zimbabwe. And I think the basic problem is this. The one is that opposition politics have been, over the years, mainly platforms for entry into power, into parliament. And secondly, the opposition movements in our region have not put across sufficiently, in my view, an alternative. And this can be seen with respect to Zimbabwe when the GNU was formed in 2008, that really the MDC was virtually swallowed by ZANU-PF. They were not able to push through their reform agenda if they had one at all. It appears to me that the major and preoccupation of opposition politics is simply to get into power with little or definition of an alternative arena for reform. This has been the main problem.
I would imagine, being an opposition party elsewhere in the region, and again, this comes from a very South African place, but I would imagine, Ibo, that you're looking at what happened in South Africa and going, gosh, with a bit of a showing, you can have a ruling party that graciously accepts a government of national unity, and then you can get at the levers of power. So even if you're mercenary, even if you're just looking for the salary, you can get a hell of a lot better salary as a diplomat at a nice foreign posting, or as the Minister of Agriculture, for instance. Surely there is an incentive here to say, doing better is better, that there is the opportunity to go beyond just getting a seat or two in parliament, that you can actually be at the heart of government for, whether that's for good purposes or whether that's purely mercenary. Do you think that there's a kind of a galvanization that's happened because of South Africa?
Well, I think the galvanization normally is galvanization against incumbency. And in the South African situation, cynics would say, well, really, what you have is a return to 1994. And that they would argue that the DA represents the defense of the apartheid era in many respects, especially on the economic front. And therefore, people would see, and even in South Africa itself, would see beyond the issue of race. They would see this as a reinforcement of the pre-94 order, or at least a return to 1994. So I think we need to be very careful about the analogy of the South African situation for the rest of the region. It's quite different. It's a different conversation altogether, in my view.
Piers,
Philip, can jump in here?
Please go ahead.
And just to say that, I think certainly in Namibia, SWAPO got a bit of a shock with what happened with the ANC. And so they are out there campaigning very vigorously. I think because they're conscious that this is something that is happening, that liberation movements are losing their shine. But at the same time, I think it's very relevant to mention that, and I don't know how it plays out in the rest of the region, but these elections are not issue-based at all. And that is quite difficult to accept given the huge problems such as unemployment, corruption, massive drought that's hit Namibia, climate change. You would think those would be issues that would be hotly contested and on the agenda, but they're not. Namibia's politics has always been about personality. And I think that remains the case until today. The opposition, for example, one opposition movement is called the IPC, Independent Patriots for Change. And the leader of that opposition party was based in London for many years. And now the SWAPO are trying to discredit him by saying he's in the pay of Western imperial agents. And, you know, it's all about personality and really not to do with the issues. And I think that is also leading to the fact that the youth are not registering. We, at the moment, have a re-registration campaign underway. And to date, I think of approximately 1.3 million eligible voters, only 800,000 have registered. So again, this is a worrying tendency. Elections always used to be considered the real barometer of a democracy. A country is a democracy because they have regular elections. But when those elections begin to lose their meaning and the political leadership is not issues-based but personality-based, then I think we really need to give attention to, as I think you mentioned earlier, the electoral systems. In Namibia, we have obviously proportional representation. Our president is directly elected by the people, which is different from South Africa. And here, I think we should be looking at a more mixed electoral system in order for accountability, at least, to come into the picture. With party lists and proportional representation, I think politicians are never accountable to the people or the servants of the people as they're supposed to be, but are instead accountable to the parties that put them in power. So I think we've got a lot of discussing to do to see if we can rescue elections and democracy ultimately, certainly in Namibia and maybe in the subcontinent as well.
Yes, I guess that's the other side of the coin that we have to talk about. On the one hand, what happens in South Africa can galvanize the opposition. On the other hand, it can galvanize those already in power. And I would imagine that, you know, a couple of parties looked at this and went, well, gosh, we might potentially have a problem here, if not now, then in the future. And democratic theory tells us that the correct response to that is then let's pull up our socks and, you know, let's get down to the service delivery and let's, you know, get infrastructure on the ground and let's make sure that the lives of our people improve, and thus they will keep us in power. What we sometimes see is not quite that. Do you have the sense that before or after South Africa went GNU, that there are parties in the region looking at ways to gerrymander, ways to keep power regardless of what the electorate might want?
Philip, I mean, I think there's evidence of that in different ways across the region in terms of the manipulation of electoral systems, who manages to get into the electoral system itself. Gwen just spoke about a registration process. In some instances, there appears to be some kind of strategy to limit registrations, and the infrastructure that's able to actually fulfill those processes can be constrained in a number of areas. So I mean, I think it's a mixed bag. There's some willful issues in play there, but there's some that relate to the limitations of our existing institutional infrastructure. So it is a mixed bag. I mean, I think also in terms of responses, there will be those who want to pull up their socks, but I think there will also be those that will be looking for how they can manipulate the system by hook or by crook. And again, the footprint of that is uneven. There's a range of different factors in play, and I think it's important that we've highlighted weaknesses in opposition, but I think it's also important to highlight the language of exclusion, which Gwen hinted at with that example of the Namibian political leader being accused of being an outsider or in the service of a foreign agenda. And of course, we see the politics of regime change and the weaponizing of sovereignty politics in Southern Africa as a way of excluding, of gaslighting, and of promoting a zero-sum approach to politics in a space which doesn't lend naturally to the kind of inclusive politics that South Africa is being forced into in some respects. I do concur with Ibo that one needs to be careful about comparisons. And of course, it's very early days in the GNU here in South Africa. But I do think a really important takeaway from the GNU is that we might see some shift from the politics of personality to the politics of policy. We saw in the immediate run-up to the GNU agreement here in South Africa, the kind of a really unpleasant politics of acrimony that plays out, and Ibo hints at that with respect to the referencing of the DA inside the government as somehow protectionist of an apartheid logic, and we've seen the weaponizing of those narratives. But there is an opportunity now to get into the nuts and bolts of issues, which I think have been avoided to a large extent, because we've got other eyes and ears inside the system in a way that we've not seen before here in South Africa. So I think watch that space in terms of what issues come to the fore and how they're addressed within government, but also within the broader polity. And we'll see what level of political maturity we have to find a common cause to improving the lot of ordinary South Africans.
Ibo, you and I have discussed proportional representation versus first past the post a little bit beforehand. And honestly, look, I was not old enough to vote in 1994. I grew up in a world of proportional representation. It's obviously the best system, and I never questioned it until we saw what happened in the UK, where, for instance, I mean, in this very stable democracy, which everyone sees as a bastion of freedom, you had the anti-immigrant Reform Party gain just about 15% of the popular vote, and they are nowhere in parliament because of the first past the post system. They just do not have a voice in parliament. I think even people who are very enamored with the UK Westminster system are saying that's not right, that is not reflecting the will of the people. And I think that might open up. And looking in South Africa, what happened in South Africa, you had kind of the more regionally focused MKP and you had the more regionally focused DA. So, you know, for that wouldn't really matter which kind of system you would have. You would probably have had a similar kind of situation in South Africa, even if you went more the way that the Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission, for instance, suggested that South Africa should go. Given everything that's happened in South Africa, given what's happening in Europe, in France as well, is there a legitimate reason to look at the systems in place in various countries? So gerrymandering aside and trying to remain in power aside, is there a question to be asked about whether other countries are suitable for a GNU and whether it's better to have a British-style system that at least gives you a strong, stable government, even if the electorate starts drifting away from it?
Yes, I think the converse situation is that from the media, at least, the British elections, recent elections, the 80% of the voters did not vote for the Labour Party, and that's a frightening statistic. It speaks loudly against the Westminster model, first past the post. But I wanted to take also note of what Gwen said earlier on. The need to balance proportional representation with representation and accountability on the part of the MP, Member of Parliament. We need to examine more closely. I have not read the Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission, but we need to examine, one, the origins of the proportional representation in those countries in which it is practiced, mainly the Nordic countries, where it's working, notwithstanding the problems to do with coalitions and so on and so forth, but it's working. And I think the most enduring feature of proportional representation is the representation representativity, inclusivity, and conduciveness to national consensus, within a democratic process, with all the accountability and process required in a democracy. So I think we need to study more carefully. But I would say at the outset that I believe more than ever before that proportional representation is the way forward for most of our countries in Africa, especially where there is so much conflict on various levels, from ethnic conflict, or the extent to which politics are express themselves in ethnic terms or racial terms for that matter. And therefore they need to ensure that even the the communities are represented in some form or other in the polity.
Gwen, I get the sense you're not the greatest fan of personality politics, and I can't really blame you given the kind of personalities that we've seen come to the fore in many places. Would it be better for Namibia not to have direct presidential elections? And I ask this because there are many people in South Africa who would like to see more direct representation. They want, ideally, MPs, regional MPs that they can point to, not a party list system. But at the very least, they want to vote for the guy in charge. They want to have direct presidential elections. They watch that happening in the US, for instance, and they go, that's a jolly good idea right there. Would Namibia be better off did it not have direct presidential elections, however the president then ended up being elected?
Well, to date, I don't think it would have really made much difference. SWAPO with the majority would have, in any case, if it was up to Parliament, would have elected the president. So it probably wouldn't have made that much difference. But I think it is something nice in democratic terms for people to have the feeling that they have a say in who becomes the president by directly voting for him or her. So I don't really have a problem with that, and I think that's a positive in many ways. I think it kind of, in a way, helps to soften the blow, if that's the right word, because, I mean, I agree with Ibo and everyone else. Proportional representation is probably the way to go in order to give especially smaller parties some kind of voice in governance. But on the other hand, it really does not promote accountability. And I think this is a problem I don't know how we're going to deal with going forward. Because clearly, as I say, those who are put on the party lists and who are sent to Parliament really don't feel any particular allegiance, although they may say they do, to voters or the electorate in general, but to the party which they serve. So I do see a really big problem with that. And I don't know how we can deal with it short of trying to mix the electoral system and having some sort of constituency-based elections. Yeah.
Pierce, you do work for the Institute for Security Studies, and I want to talk about security for a while, not least of all because in Cabo Delgado, we had the South African National Defence Force involved. Right now, we have a somewhat controversial deployment in the DRC. One of the questions people keep asking us is whether a government of national unity would see South Africa pull back from those regional military engagements, whether that's a place where, foreign policy could be influenced by the other parties now. Does it matter? I mean, does the GNU signal a change in regional posture for South Africa? And does that then have a consequence in terms of how elections are managed and run and what the outcomes might be in places like Mozambique and the DRC?
That's an interesting question, and it's one, of course, that we are trying to get our heads around. It's again, very early days to see how the new political arrangements in South Africa will impact on foreign policy, but inevitably there are going to be more eyes on foreign policy. There are going to be strengthened checks and balances, and there are going to be more questions that the state has to navigate in terms of justifying its position. So again, we're in kind of uncharted space on that front. I think there's lots and lots of unanswered questions about how South Africa is navigating its foreign policy on the continent and beyond. So I think this is an important opportunity to develop our understanding and perhaps some common positions or some modified positions around these issues. Certainly the military deployments that we've seen through the multilateral body of SADC are important developments, but ones that have raised great concern about the readiness of our security forces to be able to play that role. And it's not just about South Africa, notwithstanding its size and status in the region, but the role of other member states as well. And it's also highlighted the paucity of accompanying political diplomatic processes that are required to try and make these military operations more effective. You cannot enter into these kinds of deployments without a clear political strategy that seeks some kind of sustainable resolution. We've not seen that in the complicated setting in Mozambique, where the SADC forces have withdrawn in a somewhat unsatisfactory context. And of course, in the Congo, where we have a deployment in a febrile security situation where it seems that the deployment is not fit for purpose in terms of its military capacities, and also clearly isn't being backed up by a strong enough political strategy as well. So I'm hoping that the shift here is going to get more conversation going, more eyes on these issues, and a greater level of accountability. Certainly those options are on the table.
Ibo, you being the expert in the political economy, same question, different context. We have levers that South Africa can pull. I mean, the customs union, South Africa can use as an economic lever, presumably, to influence the region should it wish to. South Africa is a rather large player in SADC. Should we expect, have you been watching the GNU for changes in posture towards SADC, for instance? Should we expect, because of the consensus policy that now has to come out of South Africa, can, for instance, ZANU-PF expect a little less quiet diplomacy from SADC the next time round?
It's a very big question. One has to examine why up to now South Africa has not been able to use its enormous leverage as a hegemon in Southern Africa. I think the questions go beyond just the role of the former liberation movement. I think it has to do more with personalities, I might say, within the government itself. I know, for example, that the DECO had a very strong position on Zimbabwe, but was not able to navigate that position into the executive nor into the ANC. So one has to examine the levers of power or levers of policy within the new government. We are all anxious to see what happens. I think South Africa has the capacity to leverage, but it's under what conditions will it be able to do that is a big question. I'm afraid I'm not able to answer that at this point.
Fair enough. Gwen, I do have to, our readers asked us to talk about Russia and China, and I want to come to you on that first. We had a username trying to be reasonable, saying, does Russia and China have a big role to play in this, in the sense of, would they prefer to see the existing liberation movements in charge? Will they be forces for keeping things as they are? Would they like to keep a lid on changes in the region? Does that make a difference at all? Are Russia and China players in the Namibian domestic political space?
Oh yes, definitely they are. And I mean, I think that this again sort of segues into that conservatism that I worry about a lot, in the sort of appeal of populism, if you like. SWAPO has always been fairly conservative in its foreign policy, and very much still in the non-aligned movement way of thinking way back. Its allies from the struggle era remain its allies today, and the links with Russia and with China are very strong. I think there is a concern also that probably our new president, if it is the SWAPO candidate, is Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, who is kind of seen as a hawk in foreign policy terms and is very close to both Russia and China. And so there is a lot of concern, I think, even among the population, that not so much the conservatism of those countries, but the fact that they are getting quite a tight grip on, for example, the Chinese coming in and have a lot of interest in our mining and so on. And I think that is a concern to locals, to see that how easily it is for Chinese to come and live in Namibia, as opposed to, for example, fellow Africans who find it very difficult to get a work permit or come to Namibia. So I think, yes, there is a lot of concern around the Russia and the China influence. And I think that will only increase as we move towards possibly our first woman president, but very pro-China, very pro-Russia person in her own right.
Yes, we've managed to avoid mentioning Donald Trump even once in nearly an hour, which I think is quite an achievement. Thank you, everyone, for that. But I'm going to mention him now. I mean, we're looking at US foreign policy potentially shifting quite dramatically in future. China with its economic interests, Russia with its more military interests. And they must be all looking at South Africa now and wondering what comes next. I mean, what does that mean for the rest of the region? Will any of these great powers, will this rising second Cold War have an influence on whether other countries throw out their liberation movements?
Sure, that's a huge question, and again, very difficult to answer. I think much will depend on how each country learns to navigate this shifting geopolitical space. I mean, folk tend to point at saying, well, historical relations mean that they come down on this side or that side. And certainly we see with some of the SADC member states that they've clearly taken a side in where they stand. And I think Ibo will be able to talk to how that plays out with the Zimbabwean government. But I think for many countries in the region, it's about how to navigate both sides in a context where there is clearly great power competition and interest, and not just with these big powers, but other entities, for example, such as the UAE and other Gulf states and other middle powers, Turkey and so forth. They're all, this scramble for influence and access into the region requires a kind of a dexterous response, which I think is lacking in a number of countries. And I think there is an opportunity for countries to work together in a more common response. That's the ideal. I think in reality, they're likely to be picked off as personality politics allows the influences of individual states to predominate over the other. But I think we've got to have a more nuanced take of who has influence on what. And certainly when we use Russia and China in the same breath, we need to be very careful. Very, very different entities, very, very different issues that they bring to the table in Southern Africa. I mean, obviously, China is the big one here. Russia's interests are clearly important to map and to watch the expansion of interests. But we need to wait how those different entities or those different countries are playing in the region. And the shift in US politics may well have a chilling effect on how the US has been trying to re-engage in the region. But again, many people are saying that a second Trump administration, which people are expecting, may well be a little bit more delicate in terms of its approach in the region. But there again, it may not be.
Many things I would have loved to talk about, but we are out of time. Piers Bigot, while we're with you, who comes next? Which country will next go post-liberation by your estimate?
Oh, that's a really difficult one. In terms of the numbers, it's looking like it could be, in terms of how close things are, it would be Angola. But I think it's extremely unlikely the security sector in that country would allow a shift of power to UNITA. So it's very, very difficult to say. I think for the time being, the former liberation movements are going to hold the line, but it's going to be increasing pressure, and how they react to that pressure is going to be instrumental in determining the political trajectories that follow.
I've got you down for Angola 2027 in the long-term bet box. Thank you very much. Ibo Mandaza, which country falls next?
Well, I don't know. We are already in post-liberation. I don't know. I think we have overplayed this the myth of Southern African exceptionalism, based on the myth that the liberation movements would yield a different outcome to the rest of Africa. So I would like to say that we are already long ago in the post-liberation era, and that to all intents and purposes, the liberation movements have long served their purpose, and they should move on, and we have moved on. And if you look
A political answer from Ibo Mandaza there. We won't put you in the long-term bet box then, but fair enough. Gwen, would you like to venture a bet as to which country will next oust its liberation movement?
Well, I think I tend to agree with Ibo on this one, and say that, I think we are in that era in any case, and liberation movements, those that are still in power, very much on their toes. And I think really it's up to, especially in our country, it's up to the youth to determine the path towards the future, and whether that happens and how that happens, pluralism or power sharing or whatever it is. And I think it's a very, very important phase, if you like, in post-liberation Southern Africa, to say which way we go. And I'm hoping the youth are going to kind of use their power, because they certainly have power in our context, and do the right thing, inform themselves properly on the way forward and about the democratic commitment, and not lose their way and sort of get drawn into populism and the autocracies that we once upon a time fought so hard to rid the continent of. I'm just afraid that specter is staring us over the shoulder once again.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you very much, everyone. That is as much time as we have. I, for one, am much richer in my thinking in terms of the region. I know that we asked some very broad questions and we made some very broad comparisons, but I feel a bit better equipped to think about democracy within the region. Our thanks to Gwen Lister, Ibo Mandaza, Piers Pigo. Thank you so much for your time and for your input. Thank you, everyone who joined us live. Thank you for everyone who made this happen behind the scenes. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Bertram. This is a News 24 webinar. We'll be doing more of these on the region and on the continent in coming months. So keep an eye on News 24 for details on that. We'll also be unpacking some of these issues a little bit more in coming weeks in articles. We are fascinated to see what will happen in very many countries in the region in their upcoming elections, and whether South Africa's transition to a government of national unity actually influences that. Thank you very much, and we'll see you online.